Welcome back to an episode of the Chaplain's Compass podcast. This is Tremaine.
And I'm John Betz. But we all are really excited about some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. We are with Daniella Mestyanek Young. She's a scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. So we're going to jump right in. It's great to have you, Daniella.
Thanks so much for having me here.
For listeners meeting you for the very first time, could you give us a 2 to 3 minute version of your story, like your upbringing in the Children of God movement and how that shaped what you noticed about belonging, authority, and control?
Yes, so I was born 3 generations into the Children of God. The Children of God was one of these typical evangelical cults that arose out of the 60s, kind of in a pushback to the civil rights movement and other things that were going on in the country. My grandfather joined the Children of God, moved up into the leadership. My mom was one of the first children born in it, and then by the age of 15 had given birth to me. I grew up in the Children of God, which was kind of an entertainment cult. Right. We produced child and grown-up entertainment, singing, dancing, little child actress for Jesus, basically. I believe Alicia actually grew up watching some of our videos because we would sell them around the world in both evangelical circles, but also not religious circles. And we were this complete separatist cult where we didn't have any influences from the outside world. We lived on communes. We didn't go to school. We worked and we performed and we sometimes homeschooled. But the interesting thing about the Children of God is we were trafficked in front of the whole world because we were used as, performance children. When I was 15, I got myself thrown out of the Children of God. Then I put myself through high school and college, which was very weird and strange and big world and mind-opening. And then I ended up joining the Army right after college and going off to become an intelligence officer. Well, it was on day 1 of Army basic training where I realized, okay, I think I joined another cult. And I started really looking at the similarities because my second thought wasn't, oh no, my second thought was, oh, I'm going to be good at this because I know how to do this already. I know how to play this game, how to tamp down my individuality. I was an officer, so I was in leadership of the military right from the beginning. And so finally, when I left the military, I started looking at culture of all things. I said, I want to be a culture consultant and I want to look at, probably similar to a lot of the things that you all do, helping people understand groups. And ultimately, I decided I was going to continue my focus from being an intelligence officer on bad guys and bad groups and just really develop my expertise in those and how those work so that I could help people avoid them.
It's really astonishing to me to think of how you, as a 15-year-old, can have the wherewithal to even know this is not normal or, to be able to exert any individuality. And yes, I did grow up listening and watching those videos constantly. It was wild. I was listening to an episode of your podcast, Daniella, and I heard you say, oh, I grew up in Brazil. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, I know what she's talking about because we had somebody come to our house and sell videos, and they were called kitty viddies. And it was these, beautiful American children singing. Some songs were Christian, some weren't, but they had like this, they were singing in Portuguese, but had this bit of an accent that was adorable, and just, my sisters and I loved those videos until years later we realized, I think that was a cult, but we didn't know it at the time. So, but before we get to where you were able to find yourself and your individuality, can you just tell us, what did normal feel like within that growing up?
This is an interesting question that cult survivors get asked because all you know as a kid is your life, right? Especially when you're not being exposed to anything else. So we knew we were different. We knew we were in a group called the family or the Children of God or, whatever we called it in that country. And I actually really think performance is a brilliant way to traffic children, because we don't know we're being trafficked. We're just told we're missionaries singing and dancing and serving God. And as you mentioned, right, you watch those videos and they're fun and they're bright and they're happy. And like nobody sees smiling, dancing children and says, are they okay? And we very much weren't, but we were taught to perform in that way. And also for me, performance was kind of the only time when I wasn't having my individuality kind of like totally strangled. The only time I could scream as loud as I wanted to was when we were singing Baila La Bamba and I was doing Ripa, So that was just our life. But I don't think I ever kind of believed in God. I sometimes wonder if it is just a personality trait that I just don't have. Which I have learned. One of the reasons I think it's a personality trait is because I have a little baby, or she's 10. I have a 10-year-old who has not been exposed to any kind of religious anything, but she's like a little spiritual baby. And I wasn't. And I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted the outside world. I wanted to go to school. I really, really loved learning and education and being smart. And all of those things were not allowed. And in fact, I kind of think I was saved by the fact that I was so argumentative and disruptive. And so I was always being told by adults, oh, you should be a lawyer. And nobody said anything like that. The only thing we were supposed to do was grow up to be missionaries in this organization. But from the time I was like 6 years old, I was like, okay, I'm going to grow up to be a lawyer. So I guess I need to get out of here, go to high school, go to college. And I kind of had my mindset on that the whole time.
And when you're describing it, I've studied a bit of Scientology, and like they have the Sea Org and they have the Cadet Org where their children are raised to basically serve Scientology's purposes. And they also do their own alleged human trafficking. And it's just, no, you're right. They have their own performance pieces as well.
And I will tell you, when I was 22 years old, I was already an officer in the Army, and I listened to a book by Daniella Mestyanek Young, who grew up in the Children of God, who's the niece of the current leader. And I recognized my childhood in her life. And it was specifically the child labor. And I wasn't able to like put that into words. But it was interesting because so far I had only read about Children of God and other sort of Christian-based cults. And I remember thinking that Christianity was the problem and being very angry about it. And it wasn't until I read a book about Scientology, which is completely different belief system. And I was like, oh, the patterns are the same.
And going with that, cults really thrive in terms of they teach and really emphasize certainty, obedience to authority, and sometimes usually blind obedience to authority. So like, what did that teach you about your certainty, obedience, and just as a member of that group?
We were raised with, this is the only way. This is the one true way. I think that's the thing that all cults promise, right? And it is this certainty. Like, we are the army of God. We are going to be in the highest parts of heaven. Like, we even had, we are the most right kind of Christians, right? Like, these other Christians are Christians, but we're the most right kind of Christians. And I would also say it was very weird for me because I was growing up in Asia and Peru and Brazil and Mexico in these American communes. So there's this one way of life that we are being told we're supposed to have, but we're living in countries that are completely different. And I always just was never certain about it at all. And the obedience thing was very hard for me because I like to ask questions. I am neurodivergent and I'm always asking questions and thinking why about things. It was a problem for me in the military as well, where you're also supposed to have somewhat blind obedience. And I do today, I think it's actually dangerous. I think teaching your kids blind obedience sets them up for exploitation. And the same thing is true with immediacy. When people are pushing for this immediate response, especially from children, is just another way to control people, right? To not give you any time to think or be your own person. And that's really was one of the downsides of growing up in a cult, is you don't get to develop who you are, because you are always just supposed to have certainty and be obedient.
And you'd mentioned that you left at age 15. Not left, you were actually kicked out. What was it that all of a sudden made you go, oh, this isn't Camelot, this is a cult?
Yeah, so 16 was a big deal, because 16 is when you became an adult member. So in fact, the whole year that you were 15, we were receiving this like extra level of indoctrination. And some of the stuff was just crazy. Like at the time, the new leader who had taken over had this revelation called Loving Jesus. And it was basically that you're supposed to be romantically involved and having sex with Jesus. And they would have these kind of like out loud spiritual orgies. And really, really interesting thing called social proof, because you weren't allowed to read any of these secret doctrines by yourself. You had to read them in companionship with other people. And that is because if people are left alone to think about something, they'll be like, this is crazy. But if they see other people they respect not saying this is crazy, they'll go along with it. So, but one of the big things for me, I think especially came from having a teenage mom, was that I did not want to have children young, because I knew I didn't think I could get away till I was 18, because I didn't have close family outside the cult, but I knew I wanted out as soon as possible, right? I was getting out of here as soon as possible, and I could not do that with a child. And at the age of 16, I was going to be expected to start having sex indiscriminately with whoever asked for it. And we were not allowed to use birth control. So to me, it was kind of a big deal. And I also just had this thing. I need to go to high school. I need to go to high school because I want to go to college, because I want to be a lawyer. And so I got myself kicked out kind of on purpose. I, very dramatically climbed over the commune walls, went to go fellowship with an outsider, basically hang out with a boy. And I did it so many times in a row that one day I fell asleep and did not wake up in time to sneak back in.
I'm thinking as a 15-year-old, that would have felt terrifying to not have your group and to be on your own. I don't know what that felt like for you. What's the part about leaving that outsiders might underestimate the most, or just not even have a concept about?
Yeah, I mean, cult experts say it feels like death. Like it's the closest thing to dying that we can think of. It's just having everything that you understand ripped away from you. And, when you've grown up in that environment, it truly is everything you understand. In the book, I think I used the phrase, I was as afraid that I would have to leave as I was that I would have to stay. I was suffering all kinds of abuse, being a young woman in this society, from labor abuse. By the time I was 11, I was just basically like a full-time kitchen slave whenever I wasn't out in public performing. I was running kitchens for 25 people all over Brazil and Mexico. I learned how to cook really good, though. I was just like, no, I don't really care what is out there. I'm going to face it. But it was very scary, to the point that I was kind of wavering. And they, cults will always forgive you if you will bend the knee and humble yourself and do whatever the leadership says. So there was this point where I could make a choice to be sent somewhere else, be kicked out of the group back to what they call babe status. And you have to do like 6 months of kind of groveling and humbling yourself and punishment and extra work. But then after that, you're accepted again. And I was thinking about it. And my mom at the time takes me on a walk outside the commune. And my mom, very, very dedicated still to this, and would be for another decade. But she takes me outside the commune and she's like, just go. We found an older stepsister that I had from her husband had agreed to take me in. And she was like, just go. So I was like, okay, I'm out. But it was very, very scary. And one of my first thoughts when I finally was able to get enrolled in high school with no records was just, oh, I'm from another planet. There's literally almost nothing that I know about the world and almost no way to explain that to anyone because I look like this white girl that belongs in Texas.
I could see why when you did that, you also gravitated toward the military. And you also served in the United States Army in high stakes environments. You were mobilized and deployed. And so, and you served in combat. How did that military culture sharpen your ability to recognize group behavior, authority, conformity? And you mentioned that your experience in the Children of God made you go, oh, I can play the game.
So first of all, it was 6 years after I left the cult that I joined the military. And in those 6 years, I did 4 years of high school in 2 while working 40 hours a week, and then put myself through college while working up to 4 jobs and was the valedictorian of my program. So I look back now and I was like, oh, I just put myself in very high demand, high control environments so that I wouldn't have to think, I was terrified that I would fall off the deep end and go crazy and be a drug addict and all the things that the cult tells you would happen. And so I just threw myself super, super into school. Interestingly enough, years later, I would read a book that talked about how good grades can be a sign of depression. And I was like, oh, not fitting in. I couldn't make my fellow high school students want to be friends with me, but I could make the teachers like me, by being this great student. So I really think the Army really appealed to me. I remember looking forward to a summer in basic training where I would just have to turn off my brain and just, in the Army, they say, all you got to do to be successful is be in the right place at the right time in the right uniform and never volunteer for anything. Right? Don't stand out. And I was like, I can do this. I went into intelligence, I think, again, in hindsight, only way I made it 6.5 years in the Army because of how much I like to question was that it was my job to question. It was my job to look at the plan and say, what if it goes wrong? But also, there's another interesting psychological thing about how we often go into jobs that help us deal with our trauma. And so, growing up in a state of constant danger and constant anxiety, going into a job where it was my job to be like, here are all the ways the enemy is going to try to kill us, and have that. And something I still do is go into research and the way things work and knowing the threat as well as you can in order to keep yourself feeling safe. I ended up being just sort of in the right place at the right time, that I was one of the first 43 women who were on deliberate ground combat teams. So when the military really decided that they needed to start putting women onto these teams, specifically in order to engage with the Muslim population where men couldn't search women. And so, involved in some scary high stakes stuff. But, this is something else I talk about in my new book, The Culting of America, that I think once you are raised to die for an extreme belief, it isn't that crazy to transfer it to something else, So there's actually a lot of children who are raised, especially in these kind of apocalyptic groups, that go into the military. And it's just a transfer of mission and focus. And if I die for this cause, then I'm a hero, which is exactly what we grew up with.
So as somebody who's lived this personally and institutionally and now has studied it, and speaks about it, can you help us understand, what have you come to understand the difference between a group cohesion and feeling safe versus coercion and controlling for an individual?
The very first thing that I think is so helpful to understand about cults is cults are always about labor, and I think people get stuck on the what you believed what in the Children of God, right? There was religious prostitution, pedophilia, and people just say, oh, nobody could ever, but they don't get to the why. And the why is always to get your labor. And this is where, like, my simplest definition of cults is a group that coerces and manipulates you in order to get your labor. People get that very confused with fanaticism, with dedication, with group bonding, right? And it's not the same. So like when people are in a state of melding their emotions with other humans and feeling this kind of passion and purpose, a lot of times people will say, oh, ha, 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 it's like a cult. And I don't think so at all, right? I think if you're using coercive and manipulative tactics to get people's labor, it's a cult. That can be true of a regular volunteer group or a regular church, but it actually doesn't have anything to do with the fanaticism or the passion that you are feeling. It is literally the exploitation.
That's a really helpful definition, I think.
When it comes back to it, it's about gaining that free labor so that you can be able to grow the group, you can get more power, you can get more influence. And the whole purpose is so that you can continue to grow.
It's something that is very relevant to the question I get asked the most, which is, can you have a good cult? Every time I say, I get it. I get the desire, right? One time I shared one of these videos from growing up, and it's me and 6 children rapping apocalypse Bible verses in downtown Rio. And this woman, she said, oh my gosh, I grew up watching these. And I always wondered how the adults got you to do this. Like how they got 6 10-year-olds to like really get into it and throw themselves into it. And of course they did it by controlling us and beating us and all of, training us from birth. But I understand that what people want when they say a good cult is like, can I have all of this passion and dedication to my cause? And when I reword it for people, I like to say, what you're saying is, can I have an unhealthy amount of dedication and motivation and self-sacrifice from people? And that is actually, it's step 4 of my 10-step list that makes a group a cult. And self-sacrifice is so important because that is the way they break you, right? There's the leader, there's this sacred assumption that our way is right. There's the mission, the big thing that they've given you to go after. So in the Children of God, it was win the world for Jesus before the end of days. And then in order to do this, you have to self-sacrifice. And constant self-sacrifice is negative. Is how you break people. And so there are 2 parts of my 10-part list that I say are always bad, which is constant self-sacrifice and exploitation of labor. And I don't care how good your mission is. I tell my audience all the time, even fighting fascism, right? You cannot dedicate yourself 100% to anything because that breaks you. And it's one of the reasons I think cults almost always suffer from suicides, in very large numbers.
One of the things I learned from my childhood, I used to go to this Christian camp that was in Branson, Missouri. And it was one of the things that they taught was they would give the I'm Third award. It was, of course, God first, others second, yourself third. And like that messed with my mind so often because self-care is just destroyed at that point because I'm always just trying. No, you first. No, you first. What about being able to take care of yourself so that you're able to have the resources to help others? And also that you're not, or I'll use an I statement, that I'm not completely jacked up, that I can't actually be any good to anyone else.
Yeah. And, especially when you do this to children, it's very impactful because what you're supposed to be doing as a child, from the ages of 1 to 6 is like figuring out who you are. And there's 2 phases in childhood, your toddler years and your teenage years, where you are supposed to be incredibly narcissistic. Toddlers are learning that they're separate people from their mothers, and teenagers are learning that they're separate people from their family systems. And I mean, that's why nobody likes toddlers and teenagers, right? because they're incredibly narcissistic. But when you are teaching people that they always have to put themselves last, it's exactly what you said. Like self-care is the last thing that you are supposed to ever do. This, I also think, leads to cults really denigrating medical care, both mental and physical, which is something I saw not only in the cult, but also in the military, and it surprises people because you would think in the military, well, you want your soldiers to be shipshape and operational. But what I found is the cult never cares more about operations than they care about control. And getting you to sacrifice for the group all the time is the best way to control you.
You're bringing up medical care and mental health and self-care, all that. A lot of our chaplains work in healthcare on the bedside, but also in other settings like prisons and businesses and other places. And they're probably encountering people who are either in a high control environment or a cult, or who may have left and are cult survivors and are processing all of that. So let's talk about like if somebody discloses or there may be signs that we can recognize that they're a cult survivor. First of all, what would chaplains see that might raise a red flag or be something that they should be alert to? And is there a way that we're responding perhaps on the bedside that could backfire or be harmful to people who have left a cult or an environment like that?
Yeah, one of the biggest things when you leave a cult is you don't know how to make any decisions for yourself, right? You have always been told how to do it. In fact, one of the reasons that cults pop up in times of social turmoil is because the world is scary and people don't know what to do. I think I went into the military because I had no clue how to just like have a life outside of a cult or outside of school. So when you're encountering people who are leaving cults, a lot of times they're very, very scared. They're very scared to make any decisions. They've lost their certainty, right? They've always been able to rely on this group and this structure and these rules. And that's probably a little complicated for chaplains because people are used to coming to you for guidance and you're used to giving guidance. But I think that understanding that, I understand that the kind of guidance that you all give is helping people find their own answers and their own ways. And I think like that is the focus. That is the helpful thing to do, is helping people connect to what is inside of themselves, what they actually want to do. And if someone really does disclose that they were in a cult and they've said it out loud, one of the helpful things I tell people is, look, you weren't any more likely to have things go well inside the cult, right? The promise of the cult that you do all this stuff and then life is perfect, like that's a lie. So you're just as likely, and in the Children of God, it was, you're going to be killed in a car crash, if you don't like pray every day before you go in the car for God to take care of you. And people would feel very, very afraid when they left. And the answer is like, you're not any more likely to get killed in a car crash than you were 3 days ago when you still believed this, but really, I think it's a deep understanding that they either never got to form a personality or they had to really tamp down their personality. And they need to find that again. In fact, one of the things I did with my new book is I made this workbook, Unculture Yourself, which might be helpful for, some of your audience, because cults have given you this worldview. Even if they're not religious, they give you a worldview and they require you to kind of adopt this pseudo personality. That's why you always see this kind of like lazy look on people's faces, and really stepping into your own authority, figuring out what you believe and why, and what you want and why is really, really, really hard because you've lost all of your models.
You gave me two things to think about that I hadn't really considered, I think, before. One is that these people may be more susceptible to thinking of that I deserve this, that's happening to me, that I've brought this on, this illness or this injury or accident. And also that they may be more likely to say things that they think the chaplain wants to hear, to appease them. So that those may be important things for the chaplains to be thinking about.
And oftentimes, people are looking for another guru, if that makes sense. I spent 20 years being very frustrated because I was like, I'm so good at following directions. And I kept finding mentors, whether it was college professors or army colonels or business leaders. And I kept being like, what should I do with my life? Here are all my skills. What should I do? And finally realizing like I was looking for a guru, right? I was looking for someone to tell me exactly what to do with my life because that was less scary than having to pick. And I finally had like this old college professor that I'd gone back to talk about. And he, I said, I think I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this. And he just looks at me, he goes, Daniella, I think you're going to be good at any of these. And I was like, that's the best thing and the worst thing to hear. But that was one of the things that helped me realize like, oh, I have to this is my one life. I get to pick and choose how I do. And every choice you make, you're leaving a different alternate life behind. And there's no comfort for that. And in fact, if someone is telling you this is the right way to live your life, like that should be one of the warning signs, and I feel so lucky that I found mentors that just encouraged me and developed me and didn't try to control me.
Freedom and choice can feel just very scary to a lot of people who are leaving cults and high demand religions. Out of curiosity, as our chaplains are providing care for others, what are some red flags that we can just start hearing or looking for about if somebody is potentially under a group that has coercive control?
It's this lack of ability to make a decision on your own is really one of the big things. Have to talk to pastor, have to talk to someone else. In what we call 1-1 cults, abusive relationships, you can really kind of spot this sometimes when individuals like just cannot make a decision on their own. And another one that I think is interesting is like attitude and appearance control. It's called cults and coercive groups are almost always using attitude and appearance control, so people who are only kind of like happy and positive, which can be a hard thing to spot, but people who always just want to go directly to that. People, if they're telling you they're not allowed to wear certain things or they have to wear certain things, I find that appearance control really breaks down into 4 things: hair, body size, body coverage, and underwear, which are all interesting things. And, another one is just this thing I call purity requirements, which is not just sexual purity, but is any sort of binary I do not do, right? I don't put this in my mind, in my body, in my children, on my face, in my hair. I was literally in a curly hair group that I thought got very culty because it got so controlling about what you were and weren't allowed to use. So these kinds of things I think are really a good tell of controlling environments.
What are some green flags that suggest that a group might be demanding, but it's not coercive. It's not going into the culty arenas.
My biggest green flag is for systems to be sustainable, they have to be balanced. And groups that always require the good of the group to be put first is going to ultimately always hurt the individual, right? Whether it's a cult or not. And so my big green flag when someone says, how do you find good groups, is, well, where does the group sometimes lose so that the individual can win or be supported, And I think we see this a lot when one group individual, often a leader, hurts someone else. And, you understand how the person who harmed people might want to shut people up, but it's always a little bit more disappointing when the group goes, oh, you need to be quiet. Like, we need to handle this because otherwise we'll look bad, having a leader that harms someone, instead of saying, no, we're going to look good if we do this publicly and support this individual and get this person who has harmed someone either out of the group or punished, looking at it that way as like, we're going to look good if we do this. We're going to look good to our other members and our other people. That's a big green flag for me. Not passing around a collection plate. I always say if a group passes around a collection plate, it's not free. I was just at a ex-evangelical organizing event, and they talked up front about the need for money to support these things that we're doing. And that was it. Here's the QR code up front if you want to come do it. And then just in general, I would say like having good programs where people can volunteer, they can get involved with your organization, but they can also step back as necessary. And then my last big one is very, very good safeguards around children and how children's labor especially is used. I really think that so many religious organizations in this country like absolutely exploit children and call it service. And children really can't advocate for themselves, So I always say, if you would have to pay an adult to do this work, children should probably not be doing it as volunteer work.
If you had met a chaplain, Daniella, as a 15, 16-year-old, what kind of care would have been helpful for you at that point? It seems like it's such a fragile thing when somebody is either in the process of deconstruction or processing, or still maybe within the control of a group, to be able to provide care that's respectful and helpful and not going to lead them to more harm.
I always have trouble with this question when people ask, like, who could have helped you when you were 15? Because my answer is like, nobody. I was hiding from everyone. Like, I was trying so hard to just present that I was perfect. Interestingly enough, two of the leaders whom I really, really respected that I worked with in the Army were chaplains. And, I always, from the very beginning, because they're the chaplains, but they're also my colleagues because we're both officers on the staff. And I very early on would be like, I don't do religion, right? And I would tell them, like, I've had a lot of religious trauma. I don't do it. Please don't come for me. But number one, I would talk with the chaplains a lot about how, like, why can't atheists have gatherings together? Like, there's so much that you get from meeting together on a Sunday, for example, that is not about religion. It is about ritual. It is about singing, ceremony, community, all these different things. But also, the chaplains were some of my best confidants because, first of all, they were able to be in the military, right? Like, you could say anything you wanted to a chaplain and they wouldn't tell anyone. And I just think like the chaplains were very good at meeting me where I was at with lack of judgment and accepting me for that. And that actually really kind of changed my opinion on religious leaders, was encountering the specific Army chaplains that I did and the way that they held space for me and the way that they understood, and on both deployments, like where you went to get coffee and where you went to get almost every other like deodorant, toothpaste, shampoo, feminine goods came from the chaplain's office, because Americans in religious communities are really good at donating that stuff, and Girl Scout cookies. And so, it was kind of this place to just go get your needs taken care of and just talking and just listening, which would have been the same thing when I was young, just giving me a space to talk and to not push me toward anything, but to just have somebody I could confide in, because that is really what I lost when I lost, the religion that I came up in.
Number one, I love that it was the Army chaplains where they provided that safe space for you, that space for you to simply explore who you were. So going with that, how should a chaplain approach someone who's still connected to a high control group? Maybe they're not ready to call it harmful, and leaving it could also increase danger or loss. What's the best way that we, as chaplains, can approach our colleagues and the people around us?
So it's definitely not to call it a cult. I think that cult has basically almost become its own thought-stopping cliche that as soon as you say that, people will shut down. Actually using the language of high control, high demand group, I think has been really helpful for a lot of people. Like I've had active duty Mormons say, well, it's not a cult, but yeah, I can see that it's a high control, high demand group, and also just talking about the tactics, this is what I did with my book. I didn't write these groups are cults and here's why, right? Kind of call out. I wrote, these are the tactics. These are the tactics that people use to control you. And so it's almost like therapy. And I know you all know that, but it's you're never trying to tell somebody that they're in a cult or in a high control group because they'll just defend it and they'll double down. It's more about giving them the space to find that. And another tactic is that I think we understand coercive control in our lives the best when we see it in someone else's life. So I was recently on Khloe Kardashian's podcast, and I was talking to her about my own 1-1 cult that I fell into in college, toxic relationship that ends up pushing me into the military. And she goes, oh, what's that? And then I define it for her and she goes, oh, I've been in a 1-1 cult. Right. So, and I always say that part of why I wrote my memoir the way that I did, Uncultured, which is just my life story, is that you can give it to someone who you think is in a high control group, but no one ever thinks they're in a cult. So you can give it to someone and be like, there's this incredible story about this girl who grew up in the Children of God cult, and then she becomes a captain in the army. And people will read that and then they'll recognize it. They'll recognize the same things. There's a lot of stories of whether it be like Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, some of these bigger groups. And they'll say, I was sitting in a seminar where they were talking about the definition of cult. And I realized that we apply, all of our stuff kind of applied to that like the individual person in that situation. So it is, getting them to come to it by themselves, asking a lot of questions and showing parallel situations of coercive control, and then letting them make that connection.
That's a great segue to my next question, because I was going to ask you about, what you've learned about personally and just with the people that you've worked with about navigating relationships once you've stepped away from a cult, or you still have family in a cult. Because I'm thinking about our chaplains. On one side, many of us have family members who are in high control, high demand group environments that we are navigating relationships with. But also on a professional level, sometimes we're working with families, so we'll be caring for the patient, but we're not just caring for them. It's this whole family system. And some of them may be in a cult, or maybe trying to extract this person out of a cult, or maybe talking to the chaplain, trying to triangulate us into that. So any thoughts or insights you've had about relationships and families specifically?
One big thing is just that family systems can be cults. We have what we call a single family cult. Westboro Baptist Church is one of the most famous. But, I think one of the warning signs is when people have things they can't talk about outside of their family or outside of those systems, or they're afraid about telling you things that are going to get back to families. That's something to look at. I think that it is the most complicated situation when you have family either in a high control environment or the family itself is a high control environment, because as the individual is deconstructing, that is by definition gonna kind of like blow up their family system. I don't necessarily have that much advice for it other than understanding that, like, one of the important things is helping people put the regular words to things that happened. So I have never gotten more Children of God survivors angry at me than when I started saying, hey, y'all, we were trafficked as children, right? That's what they were doing. They were trafficking us around the world. And people, supporting or not supporting, just weren't there yet, right? So I think that it's really understanding that when the individual starts deconstructing their high control experience and starts putting the language of the outside world to it, that's something that you all can help with. Is actually, this is called, these camps that these teenagers are being sent to are not, whatever, they are religious prison camps, and that's a way to look at it. And then just understanding that people's family systems are going to either fall apart or like just very strongly reject them, and then being there for them when that happens, helping them understand that they can have relationships and they can have chosen family that are not going to be like that.
Those people who listen to me regularly, you could probably start a drinking game for whenever I mention spiritual struggle, where you could take a shot, because I almost bring it up because it's so relevant in a lot of things that we do. And religious and spiritual struggle is defined by like Julie Exline and Kenneth Pargament, talk about different domains, like divine struggle, doubt, moral, interpersonal, and ultimate meaning, and also the demonic or the evil. So, and going with that, a lot of what I'm hearing is a lot of mixture of this. Spiritual struggle is another word that some people would say would be deconstructing their faith. When you look at cult survivors and people who are deconstructing, what are some of the domains that show up the most, and what are some of the best compassionate responses that you could put as interventions, if you will?
I'm not sure if I exactly understand the domains thing. But, it's interesting for me because I never considered myself religious. I walked away from it at 15 and didn't look back. And I did not think I needed to deconstruct religion or faith at all until I got back on the internet and started seeing this language of deconstruction and started understanding that, like, no matter whether I believed it or not, like, the evangelical faith pool is the waters we were swimming in, and that I still had to go through that. And, I think that's one of the things I keep saying. We need to adopt the language of being or cultural evangelicals, the way I've heard people talk about being cultural Jews or cultural Catholics, and it's understanding that, like, all of the things, good and bad, in your life were connected to this high control group, which means even some of the good things. And one place where I think that religious leaders like yourselves can be really helpful is helping people understand that they don't have to walk away from everything. Like, I had a friend who told me she couldn't go to the beach anymore because she was trafficked in a beach country. And my response to her was, oh, Felicia, don't let them take the beaches, and we did some work, and eventually I made her this really great garment out of a like Brazilian sarong. And that says that don't let them take the beaches. I most recently have written a musical, Cult Baby, the musical, veterans included. And I took a bunch of the songs from the cult, the hymns, the bops that we had sung around the world, and I reused that music for my songs. So like literally taking back the music of my childhood, but also understanding that like my skill at performance and writing and all of this stuff came from that situation. And so I think one of the beautiful things about deconstruction or like the spiritual struggle is understanding that like all of those skills are yours, whether they came from negative experiences or positive experiences. I speak 3 languages fluently and I can talk to half of the globe in their language. That is a beautiful thing that I got from growing up. And I always say that if I had to grow up in the worst calm in the world, at least I got Brazilian culture out of it, which has been a long-term beautiful thing in my life. I'm actually going this summer to watch my host daughter, that exchange student that came and lived with us a decade ago, who's now graduating from medical school, and I've in Portuguese given talks in Brazil to the intelligence and security community in my second language, so finding like, what was it about that? I've had realizations that I'm really addicted to having a mission. And so both having for myself an anti-mission statement, I tell myself I'm not here to end all cults, but also finding things that I can throw myself into and get kind of that feeling, like those can be really helpful, but really, really going back to, I think it's so helpful for you all to help people realize that you don't have to lose everything just because you walked away from that high control group. My mom loved the ritual of opening up the Bible and picking a verse and claiming that for your day. So now she has this set of like woodland cards that she shuffles and she gets one and it's got like some daily quote on it, some good things to think about. And she does that, so helping people get to like, what was the feeling, right? Like, what was the feeling? What was the thing that it spoke to? Chanting makes us feel connected to other people, but I don't want to go to church anymore. Okay. Can I join? I actually have a bunch of survivors who are not religious who have joined gospel choirs. But even understanding that like there is secular music that has that same sort of praise feel to it that you might have enjoyed in the church, and finding that or writing that kind of music can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that touches on another thing that chaplains can be helpful about, which is helping people find rituals that are meaningful for them and reclaiming those parts of self. That's great. So, Daniella, you've already mentioned a lot of things about what makes a group healthy, and what are the green flags and what are the red flags in group dynamics. But I'm wondering if there's anything else that you'd like to say about group dynamics to chaplains who, okay, so let's say chaplains who serve in the military or maybe even a hospital that's starting to become really high control, high demanding. And now I've seen this, when you were both of you were talking earlier about self-care. It reminded me of a time when I was working at my local hospital, and every month they were given employee recognition awards. And I noticed with some alarm that every time it was to somebody who had poor boundaries, who had stayed late, who had worked on the weekends, who had given way more than they should have to this institution. And that's who they were saying, this is the employee we want to recognize. This is the example of a role model employee. So how can chaplains who are starting to see these signs and these red flags either speak up or in other ways demonstrate or be a safe person or help with some guardrails?
Well, one thing I've always thought is that organizations could do like self-care awards, or like, while we're giving an award for someone that always put the group first, cool, let's make an award for someone who modeled some good self-care or some good boundaries this month as well, right? And that's like an easy thing you could do. But also, I would say that chaplains tend to have a very respected position in organizations in America that group leaders will listen to. The general listens to the chaplain, even though she's only a captain in the army, and so advocating exactly that. Hey, I think we are pushing them too hard. Hey, I think that we are not illuminating self-care enough, right? So talking about those things and kind of the understanding that the group is always stronger than the individual. That's why we evolved to have groups. And so you almost always, if you're not focused on individual self-care and individual sustenance and maintenance, that the group is going to take over. So, this is something I found in the military, that the chaplain's job is to literally be the opposite of needs of the army, needs of the army, needs of the army. But then you go to the chaplain when you're breaking down, and the chaplain is able to get your boss to give you a day off. So I think just being those advocates. And I do have two little like cult vaccination phrases that I like to share, which one is, there are many valid ways to live a life. So just helping people understand that if your group or your guru is telling you this is the only way, that no, this is not the only way. There are many valid ways to live a life. And the second one, speaking of gurus, is, do what you need to do for spirituality or religion. I think that every person should have that freedom, but there are no gurus. So calling out when people are acting too guru-like, or helping people understand that, like, no matter how amazing this person is, you cannot follow them blindly. You need to be bringing in other things. It's actually one of the ways I think I built a very interesting online channel, is I was like, I don't want people to think of me as a guru. So I'm always going to be bringing in like other people's voices and other people's books and expertise to sort of subconsciously remind people that no one person has all the answers for everything. There are no gurus.
I've been following you on Instagram, and it's been fun to connect with you, and also fun to also hear more of your story. But one of the things that we always like to finish on our podcast is, we always love to ask the question, what is giving you life these days?
So for me right now, it's my 10-year-old, who's very, very, very fun and questioning and sassy and everything that I wasn't allowed to be in the cult. And two, it's the musical that I'm writing, that the 10-year-old is helping with, but not in a coerced way. Taking, putting language to these experiences that so many of us have had, but we have not been able to identify it. And just being immersed in the arts. I write very serious research books, The Culting of America. Now I'm writing an all-American fascism. But then I do this music and dancing, building thing. And everyone in my audience wants to be in it. They don't want to see it. They want to be in it. So we're figuring out how to like harness this group energy. And I'm pretty sure the cult musical is going to have a cult following. So, but not in a bad way.
As somebody who loves musicals and watched probably you on a videotape in the 90s, I love that you've reclaimed that. I love that you're doing that. And I can't wait to see the musical myself. But can you tell the audience how to find your books and just how to connect with you?
Yeah, you can find my books pretty much on any platform where you buy books. If you want signed books, you can find them at www.knittingcultlady.com, which is also how you can find me on pretty much any channel broadcasting on a daily basis. Knitting Cult Lady. I'm always knitting and deconstructing cults and tyrants and bad guys. So it is an ongoing thing, and you might find me thinking you've never been in a cult, but you're going to walk away wondering if you've been in 5 or 6. So come hang out.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really, really good to talk to you and to learn so much from you. So I hope that people will learn more, follow more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me this platform, and thanks to you both for doing what you do.
Yeah, thank you. Blessings.
And now it's time for the non-anxious presence with Elise.
And John. Well, Elise, there's so much that Daniella covered that I really enjoyed. I've heard it before, but I just forgot about it. It was that high demand religions or groups, that they're always about the labor. And that's why they're they use coercion because they're just always trying to manipulate you to get the labor. And so many times we can think about, oh, well, they've, what about their beliefs? What about their actions about this? But when it all comes down to it, it's about cheap labor.
Yeah. And maybe other things like sex and like, she said, but probably all can lead to labor. Yeah, I think that was a good aha moment for me too. And maybe for some of our audience, it's not about the belief itself, as bizarre as it may get, but it's the reason behind, which is that the belief is a means to control. And the reason for the control is all these the benefits to the group and to the group leaders, and at the expense of the individual. And so it really does help you to identify that pattern going on in other places. And obviously, I mean, she's right. If you go to somebody and say this looks like a cult, you're in a cult, that's not going to be helpful. But to be able to identify these patterns and in the ways that people are being controlled or self-sacrificing for the group, I think that can open up a conversation. And honestly, like I'm even thinking like in my own family, ways that we've recognized that and people have tried to talk about. Um, it helps you think about it through a different lens. I think to think about it in terms of the labor.
Yeah. Were there any other things that really stood out for you that we discussed?
Well, I think the way that she talked about how chaplains showed out for her in the military and the army, um, it was validating for me because it sounds a lot like what chaplains do that I know that we do, which is to meet people where they are, to be to help them question and to help them voice concerns and who they are and be honest, just have some truth telling about the tensions that they're holding, things that they thought they believed that suddenly don't believe anymore, or um, their identity that's wavering, to have a space to be honest about that. And as chaplains, to be able to be honest about there are no answers to some of these things sometimes, or, there are certainly no easy answers. So definitely not being a guru. But even like the fact that she said that she would go there to get coffee or feminine products or whatever it is, that to me made me realize how important it is when we offer hospitality in the places where we work. Sometimes we minimize that. Like, all I did was bring a cup of water, or I gave them an extra chair or a blanket that was, warm or whatever. And we think that, how can that, I mean, is that spiritual care, or is that important? But yes, it is, because we're making an environment where people can feel safe in a unfamiliar and scary environment sometimes, where they can anyway, I'm babbling at this point, but it's just to me was validating about, okay, this what we do is it's in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's using spiritual language, sometimes it's not.
One of the things in the military that some chaplains get made fun of, and they're called candy chaplains, and it's because they're known as these. Some of these chaplains would just carry candy in their pockets and just be giving it out so that it'd be an excuse to go and hang out with the soldiers, and so it that becomes a more of a derisive term. But honestly, like there are certain times where being able to use resources so that people will come and know that, hey, I'm here for practical reasons as well as religious, spiritual, humanist reasons as well.
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, a lot of the things that we did was go around with a cart with comfort things, coffee, hot cocoa, yes, prayer stones or whatever other spiritual things that people might need as well, and blessings, but at the same time, just some kind of comfort. But the other thing that I think was a takeaway for me too was when Daniela talked about certainty, and that made me think about how, I mean, we always have uncertainty, we always have change, but currently it seems like there's more of that. It's more difficult to predict the future. Things are happening very fast. We keep saying we're in unprecedented times. And I think that people may be more susceptible to wanting certainty and to wanting to be in a group where it provides you that, like where there is a guru or where there's a very clear set of rules or beliefs. And I think it can be a dangerous time for people to fall into those patterns because of how how scary it is not to have certainty.
When she was discussing that, I was thinking of, I don't know him, I know of him, and we have friends of friends, but Pete Enns, who is one of the co-hosts of the Bible for Normal People, he has a book out called "The Sin of Certainty" and why God desires our trust more than our quote unquote correct beliefs, and the idea that a lot of high demand groups, they have that hook where you come in, I'll tell you exactly what you need to hear because you're feeling very helpless. I'll empower you to say you have this power because you now belong to something bigger than yourself. And that could be dangerous. Yeah.
It even made me think about, when she was talking about this great professor that she had that allowed her the freedom to know she can pick. And yes, I'm with her. Like having the options can be scary. But I remember thinking about that in college because I heard so many people say God has a plan for you. God has a plan for you. And at some point it starts to become like prescriptive, like there is one plan, there's one path that you have to do. And if you mess up, if you don't recognize what it is, then you're ruining God's plan somehow. And I remember in college realizing that no, God doesn't have like one plan for me. Like there's not one career path that God wants me to choose. I am free to choose, and God is more interested, I mean, in my theological belief, in who I am than in what I am doing career wise. But I think He can language like that, God wants you to do this, or God has told me, or God has a plan for you. That can certainly be weaponized in groups like that.
And I loved her vaccination phrases, anti-cult vaccination phrases. Uh, there are many valid ways to live a life, and you can do what you need to do in religious or spiritual circles and to religion and spirituality, but there are no gurus. And the way she defined that is there are no all-knowing blind faith gurus that you need to just devote your entire self to. So I wanted to read from inside her book, and yes, this is an N95. In her book, The Culting of America, she has on page 264, she talks about identity versus control. And I thought this would be great for our chaplains and religious affairs specialists and religious care professionals. She writes, just as a group can elevate you, it can also erase you. Our deep need for connection makes us vulnerable to manipulation. The same mechanisms we evolved to keep us safe and bonded can be hijacked by systems that exploit our social instincts. See, when a group offers belonging, shared rituals, and emotional attunement, especially during moments of personal crisis or disconnection, it can feel neurologically regulating, even if a group is coercive. Co regulation feels like safety to us, even when it's embedded in control. And people often stay in environments that are externally harmful but internally soothing because their nervous systems are responding to perceived connection, not reason. This evolutionary design also helps explain our deep craving for community, but also the ways it can bind, exploit, and entrap. And I loved how she had mentioned that it was all about, we might have those times in those high demand groups. So, how do we take those times that are positive and those experiences that are positive and apply them in healthy ways rather than just demonizing that everything was bad?
And reclaiming the things that are important to you and parts of yourself. I love that. Well, thank you all for listening. Hope to see you again.
Thank you. Bye bye.